My name is GM Jesse Kraai, and this is my series about the advanced variation against the French. Now, generally, when people are learning an opening, they're thinking about an immediate practical result, and that's totally understandable. What often gets missed, though, is that the opening itself is not going to make you that much of a better player. What will improve your game really is a deeper understanding of positional stuff going on kind of behind the scenes, in addition, of course, to tactics and endgames and all the other stuff that goes into being a good player. Now, one of the very interesting and nice things about the advanced variation of the French, and almost all variations of the French really, is we're going to get the structure that we see on the board. And the reason this is especially important or interesting for all chess players is that it forces us to deal with something very difficult right away, and that is the concept of space. So, for example, if we look at this position, this pawn on e4 is fighting for a central square on d5. When you play e5, what you've actually done is you've surrendered a lot of the center to black, even though it might not feel that way. Black now controls these two squares vigorously. What you've done is you've pushed past this line and you're looking beyond the center and looking really for space. And that's going to be a big subject of this whole series, is just talking about what a space advantage means. And I think playing this variation should, in addition to, being a weapon against the French, it should be a player's meditation stone, if you will, on what it means for a space advantage. And I'll say, as someone who's played the French and continues to play the French, that the main reason I've been successful in playing the French is that people do not understand what the space advantage is or how it works, how to play with it. And in fact, it's a very difficult skill to learn. Now, almost regardless of which variation you play against the French, whether it's, say, knight c3 or knight d2, e5 is almost always going to come. And if the reason is that if you want to get an advantage, you need to keep this bishop locked down. Now, with that said, I will say it's a good practical attempt to do this, mostly because it will break the French player's heart. He doesn't want to face this situation. And I'll say, thankfully for me as a French player, it comes up pretty rarely. And the good news is white usually does something weird in the next couple moves. Sometimes they play c4 and whatever. In any case, this is not our subject, though if you wanted to terrorize the French player, that would be the way to do it. Now, as I said, as a French player, what these people do is they've kind of got a sense of what's going on in the resulting structure after e5. And so what we're going to talk about today is a lot of the principles that are just at stake with this structure. And then we're going to move on to what might be called theory in the next couple video episodes. Now, before we talk about space and all the fundamentals, I want to say a couple words about why this makes sense, e5 does, on a practical level. First, I want to say, as a French player, that I encounter the advanced variation very rarely, maybe 5%. I feel like I get knight c3 and knight d2 85% of the time, and the other 5%, the other 10% is maybe 5% exchange variation and 5% this thing, right? The King's Indian attack against the French. So just right away, I want to say, as someone who's played it a lot, I haven't, from the black side, it's not something I spend a lot of time thinking or worrying about because so few players do it. And I think mostly that has to do with trends. People are following, Fabi is playing knight c3, other people are playing knight d2, and those are the people average chip players like me are following when they decide to choose an opening. And so already you're going to be facing people. I as a GM, maybe, I've looked at this several times as black, but it's not something present in my mind because it's just not that often played. So that's the first advantage. The second advantage, I think, is really simplicity. If you play knight c3, you have to learn a lot of stuff, and it's very complicated. And let me just mention two things. First, you've got bishop b4, first of all, which I consider a heretical decision because oftentimes you're going to lose your beautiful bishop. Or you can face knight f6, and this becomes very frightening in, say, this standard position here, where black has many, many moves. a6, cd, queen b6, bishop e7. I think f6 is even playable. All of these things are something you have to kind of master. Or if you try to do this move, you have to master de, bishop e7, and bishop b4, right? All of these things are very involved. And especially for old guys like myself, I don't want to learn that many lines that are forcing. I'd much rather have something that I can just understand the principles of. And in a similar way, if you play knight d2, you have to worry about c5, knight f6, bishop e7, and God knows what else. Both moves, knight c3, knight d2, also are subject to the subhuman attempt of de, sometimes called the Rubinstein variation. And that's, of course, something that the advanced variation will get out of entirely. Okay, so that's just some practical stuff that will make e5 a little bit easier to play, and will also make it an idea mostly an opening, mostly about ideas. Okay, now I'd like to look at a position that you probably think has nothing to do with the French, but I'm going to say it does. And so let's look at this. This is, of course, a King's Indian, and it feels at first like this has absolutely nothing to do with the French, but I would like to tell you that it does. Okay, in the King's Indian, what black is doing is he is saying, please, excuse me, get rid of that arrow, please commit this pawn. And this move order e5 was championed by Fischer, and a standard variation could go something like this. Many moves are possible here, but what I want you to see is that this is the mirror image. This pawn structure is the mirror image of the French. Let's go back and just take a look. So let's say c5, c3, the mirror image of this position. And it's useful to think about because the first thing I want to say in just a fundamental way that has to do with chess understanding, both in the French and the King's Indian, arguably in all closed positions, is that the thing you want to pay attention to is the pointing of the pawns. So, for example, the black pawns here are pointing towards the king's side. And the significance of that is that helps show us which side is strong for either player. So in this case, the pawns for black pointing to the king's side means that it is the strong side for black, the king's side is. Whereas white is attacking this way, and for him, that's the strong side, the queen's side. Now, let's say some obvious things that will flip themselves in the French. Notice that white got a much better version in a lot of ways. For example, in the French, you get to play c5 immediately. And in the King's Indian, you got to do some dance with knight d7 and then play f5. And white also easily got that pawn on c4 with basically for free. But the reason, and this is really important, the reason why the King's Indian is so dangerous, even though it seems like it's lost some time, is that black will start advancing and the king is over here. So the poor king is right in the way of all of this avalanche that black is about to throw down at him. And so the king position is critical when you start thinking about the pointing of the pawns. Okay, we are going to come back to the King's Indian in several cases because it will help us understand some basic stuff. But let's just say some two quick points. This bishop bad, this bishop amazing, right? And the same thing is going to be true in the French. Okay, so what I thought I would do is before we go on and talk about this particular position, I want to give a little bit more background on what the pointing of the pawns, kind of flesh out what the pointing of the pawns means. And then we're going to come back and talk about space. And then I promise we'll get to a more theoretical discussion. But I wanted to first do this basic stuff because a lot of this was stuff that I didn't understand as a French player, and I had played it forever. The pointing of the pawns and space in particular. Space, we're going to find, is a very difficult concept and on a practical level, a very difficult skill to master, to play with space and to play also without space. Okay, so the first game I want to show is a famous game a variation that Nimzowitsch developed, I think, 1920s. Okay, so this game, he plays Queen G4, and it seems so against all of chess principles seem to be offended. But it's an incredibly deep move. And there's a couple things I want you to appreciate about this. First, it's important to realize that you want to play on the strong side. So white's strong side is, of course, the king's side. And that means bringing your force count, your forces over there. And your force count, which just means how many guys you have, is going to be, of course, dramatically increased if you can bring your pieces over, but especially your queen, to the king side. So that's the first thing that Queen G4 does. The next thing is pretty peculiar, and that is, well, we give him the pawn. And from black's perspective, what we're going to see in all French variations really is the tension on D4 that gives black some counterplay and makes it difficult for white to execute some big blowout on the king side. It's like a little toehold for black. Now, the genius of allowing black to take here is that Nimzowitsch says, oh no, your pawn is actually in the way of any possible play you might have on the on D4. So it's actually simply in the way, and the important point is going to be this E5 square. Right? So let's quickly roll through two games that kind of illustrate what's going on and a couple of the ideas that we are going to use in the advanced variation of the French. So black can do a bunch of things. We'll see a different attempt in game 2. But we're just going to overprotect the E5 square. Oh, push this knight away when we want. And now A3. We are going to use this A3 maneuver ourselves. And at first it seems like Nimzowitsch is playing A3 to prevent the knight from coming to take the bishop or something. And that's certainly a point. But what we're going to see in the advanced variation and in these two games is that there's a way to play with a global strategy, which means I'm not just going to murder you on the king side, but I'm also going to try to take away some space on the queen side. And me taking away the space on the queen side will, first of all, be a prophylactic maneuver just to stop you from doing things over there. We're going to talk more about that, but let me show you some examples first. So, black is obviously really getting pushed around, and knight d2 would be, I would say, the more natural move here. But bishop d2 is great because now we're aiming to push black all the way back. Knight b8, c3, excellent move. We will see in the advanced variation of the French as well that sometimes we can open up a second front if they decide to castle long, like black has done here. Black decides to get out of dodge, and his queen gets hurled into the emptiness on a8. And here we just have a very instructive finish. Queen takes d7, and black resigns. Knight d7, knight e6. Now, one thing I want to turn you on to is the game lasted only 28 moves. But oftentimes when you're in a closed position where you're playing for space, it will feel like the game is going on much longer than it actually is, because it doesn't feel like things are necessarily moving. But then when you look back on a lot of these games that we're going to say, they didn't actually last that long. All right, let's look at game number 2. So, again, queen g4. And a slightly different attempt. And one of the things that I want you to be aware of is that when we start our business on the king's side, a key freeing move for black that will also fight for the center will be to at some point play f6. And when he does so, the big question is going to be, how strong is my control over e5? It's not the end of the world, as we'll see from this game, if I, have to play ef. It's really, the question is, can I control the e5 square? So you see, everything about the white position is really designed to overprotect. That was the concept that Nimzowitsch came up with, to overprotect the e5 square. Okay, bishop c5, h4 again. Now, I want to say about h4 that we will see this in the advance as well, that first of all, I want you to realize that it's not a weakening of our position in front of our king, because that is our side of the board, the king's side is. And the reason he can't take advantage easily of pawn moves on our strong side is that we have so much force there that he doesn't have enough material to make the weaknesses count, right? Whereas you can see he's got a lot on the queen side. So king f8, let's smush this guy back. And now our famous a3. So it's a global strategy. White is going to take over the king side. The aim is to take over the king side and the queen side. a5 is, of course, a weakness. And watch this following game. To me, it's stunning. So here we go. Bishop g5. Bishop f6 is the threat. Knight d2. And black says, all right, I'm busting out. Okay. Takes. So this is an important thing. Despite the fact that black trades the queens, what we are going to see is that the scrunch is still on. By the scrunch, I just mean the overwhelming attack that white has going on. And one of the key things that we're going to talk a lot about the space advantage is that we are trying to make one or more of black's pieces bad. And in this case, of course, we're especially talking to these two pieces. And by bad, we just want to say that they can't play a part in the game. A metaphor that you might find useful is when I was a kid, I I was on the wrestling team. I was absolutely terrible at it. But a key idea that I liked was that in general, if you can just control something of your opponent's, maybe it's an ankle, maybe it's a wrist, then that you should trust as being a good thing. You shouldn't second guess that. And that's what's will go on in almost every game where you have a space advantage, because one or more of the pieces will be poor because they simply have less room to move. We'll talk more about that. Why bishop b5? Mostly because we are trying to fight for this square. Knight f, brilliant. Watch how this goes down. King f7, c4, amazing. Snip, check, and now f7. And it might not be immediately obvious why this is so terrible, but the problem is that if you move the knight, bishop f6 is not just threatening to win the rook. Excuse me, I didn't mean for it to jump like that. Not just threatening to win the rook, but threatening mate on bishop g7. There's no way out. There's nothing for him to do. We're going to play king h2 very soon. Snip, our queen, and now we're just up a piece. And black resigned. Okay, so I would be remiss if I didn't tell you what the problem was with this queen g4 move. Basically, all of Nimzovich's opponents. There's another game where he plays against Vera Menchik, who was then, I guess you could call her the women's world champion of the day, where he plays this as well, if you want to look that up. The problem is that here CD would be very similar. Also, knight d4 would be very similar to the games we looked at. But there's a disturbing little Sichenzug in between move with queen a5 that black can throw in. And it's a little bit difficult now for white to respond. If knight b4, I believe, knight d2, I believe knight b4 is just really hard to meet. If bishop d2, there's queen b6. And of course, in this position of bishop d3, we're going to play c4. And I should say the other key point is that, and the point which really, shows what white's up to here, is the problem with c3, which normally you would say, oh, this is great for us. Now our pawn is active on d4, i.e. it's going places, namely c3, and so white can't simply ignore it as he was doing in the other variations. Okay, let's look at a third example. This is again about the pointing of space. So as I mentioned, the King's Indian attack, it's funny, it's something that Fischer ended up playing because the French became difficult for him. And in a funny way, you might want to say something about Fischer in space, where the guy didn't, maybe, I think part of the reason he didn't do well against the French is he didn't really have a good sense of how to play with space. And that's a funny thing to say about a very universal world champion, that he would have a weakness like that. But he definitely had a problem with the French. And so what he did in many games is just said to himself, well, to hell with it, I'll just play the King's Indian, which he played, of course, as black. I'll just play the King's Indian against the French. Now, one reason I chose this game is I want you to see that, like the Nimzovich variation, what white has done is he's avoided the d4 struggle. Okay, and again focused on the e5 point. Now, we could analyze this game all day. I just want to give you a sense of this, of how things went. Remember, h4 is going to be part of your vocabulary of plans as well. I like that phrase a lot, by the way, vocabulary of plans. In a sense, I think that's what most if you have a good opening work, it's going to be that you have a vocabulary of plans, of things you can do in any given situation. And of course, you'll choose a different plan based on what your opponent does. First thing we see, overprotection of e5. And a3 is controversial. Many moves. This is a very theoretical position even now. This game was played against Miyagi, Missouri in 1967. Knight h2, knight g5, h5, all of these things are very kind of well-rehearsed things. a3 is trying to slow it up. Now, I do want to say this. a3 is controversial because white is moving a pawn on his weak side of the board. So remember, black here, when you come at it this way, where you're letting black expand on the queen side, you are at risk, really, of the guy breaking through on the queen side before you get your business done on the king side. And so that's going to be a key thing for us to think about how we approach the advanced variation. Now, all right, so a3, snip. Many different possible moves here for black, and some of them are definitely wrong. I want to pay some attention to bishop h3 because it probably seems mysterious. The point of bishop h3, okay, and this is a thing I really want to hone your sensibility to, because it will come up in the advance as well, is that when you've got this scrunch against the king side over here, black's key method of giving himself a little bit of space is f6. f6 will liberate the rook and probably, maybe even more importantly, give the opportunity for some lateral protection of the king. So bishop h3 in this position is all about making f6 impossible. And on a broader strategic level, what one can say about what's happening in this position is white saying, if I can prevent f6, my greater force count should eventually show against the king. And let's talk about force count. There's really only one piece that's involved in the defense of the black position. Everybody else is shunted out by the power of this big fat pawn. And so when we talk about the pointing of the pawns, we're also talking about it in this position. This is still the pointing of the pawns, with e5 as being your wedge. Okay, we do some dancing. And now that we got rid of the bishop on e7, we can claim a greater force count. And bishop f6, a famous move. And we're going to see several examples of things like this, where the finish, we can talk about theory and shmiri and yada yada, but you need to learn how to finish the position. And looking at a move like bishop f6 will give you the confidence to look for moves like this and to believe in them when the black king is out and lonesome. And it will happen a lot when you have space. Or another way of saying it is, with a space advantage, you are always playing against one or more of your pieces which are poor, and often one of those pieces will simply be the black king, as it is here. Queen g5 is the threat, so black is intending queen f8. And so the reason queen h6 doesn't happen is we don't want to do it if queen f8 is going to kick us out. The rook is now coming to be part of the attack. Exclam, bishop g2, what's the point? Threatening mate, check, and the guy has to resign. The point being snip, snap, and snop. Right. Okay, so those three games were a way for me to first just address some of the broader concepts of the pointing of the pawns and what it means. And if I can, I'd like to just summarize and say, when we come back to our key position here, that long term, you're looking to get your lady over here on the king side. It might not happen immediately, but that is the long-term aim, is to overwhelm black with force on our side of the board. And also to be cognizant that black would like to gain counterplay on the queen side. And the problem for him, of course, is generally our king is not on the queen side for him to actually attack. It's going to be an avenue, though, if black is going to dream about the king. And I'll tell you, as a French player, when you do end up coming at the king a lot, but generally it'll happen kind of like we're coming in here and then we come this way. Similarly, in the King's Indian, if white wins against the King's Indian, it's generally coming in on the queen side and then penetrating this way. So the thing you need to respect with the King's Indian, a lot of players, for example, who just start the King's Indian are terrified of advancing the pawns in front of their king, and they don't understand what the point of the opening is. That's your side of the board over there. In a similar way, black shouldn't fear doing things like b5 and a5 and the whole business. Launch it, light a fire over there, black, light a fire. Okay, so let me now try to convey the difficult question of space. There's a recent book by Gelfand on positional chess that came out, and in that book was this example, which is actually from an older Russian book called Simple Chess by Michael Stein. And it's a great example, and I want to quote the 78 book in just a way of understanding what the space advantage is about, because it's definitely a mind bender. And if you can get your mind wrapped around it just a little bit, it'll help you, of course, not only with what we're talking about with the advanced variation, but there will be several positions where you will have a space advantage. And you will, be an opportunity. You might find yourself in this position to use it. Okay, let me read you this beautiful paragraph here. The visual impression you obtain by glancing at a position and estimating who seems to have the lion's share can be misleading. The following is near the truth. Any given pawn structure has a certain capacity. I'm going to say that word again, capacity, for accommodating pieces efficiently. Exceed this capacity and the pieces get in each other's way, and so reduce their mutual activity. The problem of overpopulation is easy to sense when playing a position. It feels cramped. And so I've spent a lot of time looking at this position, and I will admit that when I played as a kid, I had to make some money, and I played the Hustlers on the Lakeshore Drive in Chicago. I had a guy, and he played this terrible move against me many times. And I want to say I knew that it was an advantage, but I didn't appreciate how strong it was. So let's talk a little bit about this position. Certain features of this will come up in the advance. And so I want to spend some time looking at a different position so you get a sense of what a different overpopulation is. Okay, now let's first of all focus on the square knight d7, because he is the piece that's poisoning the position. Obviously, he's blocking the bishop, and that's a big problem. However, I want you to also see that because the bishop is blocked from coming out, the rook is also having grief coming out. In addition to that, he's also blocking the queen's access to d6, and that's actually a very significant thing because it means that black cannot play e6 himself because the d6 pawn is hanging. All right, let me say something else obvious. These knights are what we call reduplicating. They are in each other's way. And because that knight on f6 can't come back, the bishop is blocked. So it's a whole cluster of problems for black, an incredible cluster of problems. And the question you might ask yourself here, I'll give a moment even to think about it, is how bad do you think it is? How bad do you think it is for black? And the amazing answer is that it's quite bad. It's something close to strategically lost. Now, it seems funny to say it. It seems funny to say it because lost is a big word. But at the very least, I want you to appreciate that black is in big trouble. Now, playing for white isn't necessarily such an easy task. And so let's talk about what it means to play for space advantage. First, you have to be laser focused on keeping the pieces tied down, not letting them out, not letting them trade off in particular. And one thing I will say as a French player is I think one of the reasons I've had success is people let me trade and reduce the tension. And then we're going to see that, like the example I'm about to show with this position, if black gets some trades, it's a lot easier for him to deal with things. So the moves that white is looking for is not necessarily some big crash against the king, but rather moves like h3 to stop the knight from moving. Right? Bishop f4 to make it difficult for this knight to come here, to make it difficult for this pawn to move. So really, the task is more keeping him in the box rather than some big conception of wham bam, I'm gonna go mate you. Right? It's a different kind of chess. And even if you decide that this space thing is over your head and you don't want to deal with it, one thing you should appreciate is that it's if you're a chess fan like myself, is that it's a huge feature of chess at the highest level now, appreciating space and learning how to use it. Now, let me show you the position that's almost the same as this, but has very different, and I'll just ask you what you think about it. So I took off two pieces, the knight on c3 and the bishop on e2, bishop on c8, knight on f6. Now what do you think of the position? Well, the amazing thing is now we have to actually say that black is better. That's surprising to me. Black is better and white is essentially overextended. So, first of all, let's note that the knight on d7 is not blocking the bishop anymore. He's not blocking this knight, and this bishop is free. So he really has achieved coordination. And white, on the other hand, the space advantage isn't good for anything. And in fact, there's a bunch of squares like white now has to control, and these things might become weaknesses, whereas we look at black's, excuse me, that was a wild jump. Whereas we look at black's position, he has no weaknesses. Now, I don't want to go too deep on this because this is really a lecture about the advanced variation, but I think black's best move here is instructive. He has more than one, but going to the Benko, is definitely, I think, a great option here, and it shows what the Benko was about, which is, I want to create drama on the queen side so that you can't do anything in the center and also not use your space advantage. So here we go, queen a8, rook b8. There's other things you could do. You could do queen a5, rook b8. All these things are available to black. And to me, I want to say it was a big revelation to understand that this was in fact a better position for black. And so when we think about playing the advanced variation or any variation with space, we have to realize that the trading of the pieces is something that can lead us into trouble. And when you're playing with average players who aren't thinking about space, trades kind of just naturally happen, right? They just kind of naturally happen as the course of the game goes on. And so that's something that you need to be hyper aware of when you play the advanced variation. Okay? All right, now let's return here to this position, and I'm going to talk a little bit now about the specifics of this particular position and outline what, let's call it, our course of action through this series of videos is going to be. Black has several moves here, but our next two moves from here are basically always going to be the same. Knight c6. Again, we'll talk about different moves that Black does. Knight f3. Let's just say queen b6 now. There's other moves. And we are going to play a3. Now, as you remember, this a3, b4 thing came up with Nimzowitsch as well. And it's a very deep idea. And what I want you to appreciate here is that we are playing for full-on space with this a3 move. All right. Now, what is the intention? The intention is to play b4. And you can say to me, Jesse, wait a second. You just told me that you don't want to move pawns on the weak side of the board. And that's why it's really important to appreciate that this plan of a3, b4 is very ambitious. Now, before we get into a3, b4, I want to say this. Our notion here is a very simple plan, but hard to execute, of saying priority number one prevents all counterplay against d4. And the word I like about it is to say we want to consolidate the d4 point. And one thing b4 will do, and we'll cover it in a later variation, is bishop b2 to control the square. So, point one is we consolidate d4 and we prevent Black's movement through the pawn. Remember, it's not necessarily a fear of losing the pawn. It's the ability for Black to use the square for his pieces. Contrast it for a moment with this beautiful position here. The pieces could not move through this square, and that was ultimately the problem. So we are preventing the movement through that square. With a3, we are then making a secondary attempt to say we are going to shut down the play on the queen side. All right. Now, as we talked about the King's Indian before, I want to bring it back and show you that there's an analogous idea over here, and that is to play h3, e5, let's say bishop e2, and there's a variety of moves here, but let's just say bishop e3, something like this, a5, and g4. This g4 idea can be implemented in a variety of ways, but what I want you to see here is that Black players will be afraid to play f5 because they're worried about rook g1 and the king getting mated. And in some variations, that is a concern. However, a deeper idea for white as well is just to play knight d2 and f3 and say, you shall not pass. I will hold the line, and that g4 pawn is going to prevent a lot of movement of the Black pieces getting in to my position on the king side. So I wanted to show this example because it highlights what we're doing with this a3 move. We are making a big attempt at space. For example, if we look at the Fischer game and just pull up, say, this position, what white does here is he's engaged in a race with black and to say, well, black, I am racing you to see if I mate you first on the king side or if you crash through on the queen side and make me divert all my stuff over there. That is not what we're doing with the advance. We're saying, I want to win the d4 battle, I want to win the queenside battle, and then I'm going to squish you into a bug. I'm going to squish you like a bug. Let me put it that way. But so many of the things we talked about with the Fischer and the Nimzo games are still going to be present in the position, namely the pointing of the pawns, the prevention or dealing with the f6 break. And that is ultimately our side of the board where we are allowed to play things like h4. Okay, now I want to wrap this up a little bit, but I want to sketch a little bit about what it's going to kind of look like, because black himself has a big choice here, and I consider this next move kind of like the big branching off point for black. Black can decide to allow b4, or he can decide to shut it down with c4. And we're going to begin by looking at this move c4 in the next lecture. And the thing that I want to say about the c4 move is that it's very controversial, and although I don't think it's a technically bad move, that as a French player, it breaks my heart. It breaks my heart to lose a tempo with c4, and it breaks my heart to lose the pressure on d4. So the first thing we need to say when they play c4 is that we have already won our first battle, which is control of the d4 square. We've won that one. Okay. The other option, of course, is for black to make some kind of developing move like knight h6 or bishop d7, maybe even f6. And we're going to look at all those, let's call those the active attempts towards the end of the series. For now, let's just say that obviously he's blocking the bishop and has dreams of somehow doing this with the b3 square. So we're going to get into it. Coming up, I hope you can join me. It's a really fascinating adventure where it's going to be mostly about ideas, and there will be some things you can call variations, but one of the things I want to stress about this kind of play is that whenever you get a closed position, the variations will be less concrete than they are in an open position. And in terms of preparing your opening, the more closed it is, the more you can rely on ideas and less on specific variations. For example, if you're playing an open Sicilian, then yes, learn some ideas or learn some variations and get it all hashed out with the computer and yada yada. If it's going to be closed, then there's going to be more freedom because your opponent will do other things and you will simply have to use your ideas to your vocabulary of plans to deal with what's going on in the position. And what I mean by that, maybe I'm repeating myself, but it's a good thing, is that when you have a closed position, there will be more plans, more moves available to both sides. And that's why it's more of a thing about big ideas rather than concrete variations. And for most of us, definitely myself included, I am done with learning, hectic, long variations and want to more rely on ideas. Okay, so this was our introduction, and I hope you can join me for part 2, where we'll begin our discussion about this move, c4. All right, till then.